think what I'm going to start out by doing is just going through some slides and rattling on for about 20, maybe 25 minutes, get through them, set the stage for sort of this, and then have a good discussion with you, probably more to the psychological angle than to threat perception and to science communication and things that concern cognitive scientists. Okay, so here's a little overview I wanted to talk about. I'm going to start out by talking a bit about the physical science and impacts, and then talk about the social science, including about me and how I came to be involved in the psychological aspects of climate crisis work and how that connects with the rest of my lab and my career. So I want you to just pause for a minute here and sort of, I'll keep quiet and give you 20 seconds to just ask yourself, can you explain to yourself in your own mind the greenhouse gas effect? I normally do this with like a little Google sheet, but I figured we'll just do it in our heads. Okay, and so the answer is that unless you've really thought about this or taken classes in this, you probably can't. So don't be embarrassed, because that's like 99% of people. So briefly, just to review the greenhouse gas effect, there's the sun, and the sun sends sunlight to Earth. And most of that sunlight, some of it bounces back, but most of it is absorbed by the ocean and the land. And later on, some of this energy as infrared, okay? Sunlight comes in and infrared goes back. Infrared energy is irradiated. Much of it will just go through to space, but some of it will get effectively captured by molecules of greenhouse gases, being carbon dioxide, methane, and so forth. And they basically effectively absorb this infrared energy, and that leads to heating of the lower atmosphere and then heating of the planet. That's the greenhouse gas effect. It's not really a greenhouse. A blanket is a kind of a better way of thinking. It's like when you put a blanket on, the blanket keeps you warm, not because blanket makes warmth, but because blanket is capturing the heat that otherwise would go out of your body. Now, the energy that's being added by the greenhouse gas effect is equivalent to about 4 Hiroshima bombs of energy every second, of every minute, of every hour, of every day for decades. All right, that's how much energy is being added by the greenhouse gas effect. And that is what is fueling the extreme weather events. So it's getting hot. Now, this shows us, for example, in 2005, a map of the world showing us about 1 degree Celsius, about 1.8 Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, just 1 year. And you can see particularly Australia, Southern Africa, parts of Asia, and particularly the Arctic and northern parts. This is called Arctic amplification, which is probably why we had the deep freeze now in Texas and elsewhere, by pushing down that cold air. But it wasn't 2005, it was 6, 7, 9, 14, 15, 16, 17, and NASA said that 2020 was the hottest year ever recorded. So if we look at the average of 2000 to 2019, we have about 1 degree Celsius. Some people are saying we're at 1.1 or even 1.2 sometimes now, above pre-industrial levels. So this is an average, an aggregate, right? It's getting hot. And we can kind of look at this in historical terms going back 2,000 years. We should actually be going a little bit into a small ice age to do with how we're oriented towards the sun. And we should really be getting slightly cooler, but actually you can see what's happened in the last 200 years. We've had this huge increase of temperature, taking us now to about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. And this increase of temperature that's occurred in this recent period is related, and I'm not going to prove this to you now, it's not really what I'm going to talk about, but it's related to the increase of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere that's occurred in the last 200 years that coincides perfectly with the massive release of carbon dioxide by fossil fuel burning since the Industrial Revolution. So we can kind of estimate all the coal and oil and natural and methane gas that's been burned and released since the Industrial Revolution, and it coincides very tightly with atmospheric CO2 levels. All right, now, notwithstanding all of this, here's a map from the Yale Climate Change Communication Group. You can Google that later on, Climate Opinion Maps. It's a great group at Yale that's been measuring adult American beliefs on these issues for 10 years now. And here is a map showing us that only, this is 2019 data, but it's pretty similar in 2020. This is how many adults in America think that global warming is caused by humans. I mean, lots of people think it's happening, but how many think it's caused by humans? And only 53% do. And they're clustered, by the way, in typical kind of metro areas that correspond to being more liberal or having more extreme weather events, like around Florida and around the Gulf and around parts of California where it's getting dramatic. So extreme weather has some impact on this. But anyway, the point is 53% of American adults, this is astonishing, because if you go to Japan, Germany, China, most European countries, it's in the 90% levels. So this is a confusion in the American mind that has been deliberately created and fostered by several decades of misinformation campaigns, starting from the 1980s, fostered by the fossil fuel companies and their political allies, that has created a wedge in the American mind that creates confusion about this. So this is the skepticism we're dealing with, and this is extremely significant politically, because unless we get some bipartisan, serious climate action in this decade, we're in real trouble and our futures are compromised. Now, I want to talk briefly here about categories of skepticism. Satvika, what was crazy? You're just commenting. All right.
I was just saying it's crazy that like only 53% of people think
it is crazy. It's crazy. It's a evidence of a fantastic campaign of misinformation that's been successful. Okay, so if we look at the US, this is my simplistic view of the world. Okay, if we look at the US population, adults say we're going to have people who are skeptic about the human cause, as we saw, and then there's about 53% who accept that there's a human cause. Now, of the people who accept there's a human cause, there's going to be some that are skeptic about impacts. They're going to say, yeah, I know it's human cause, but I think it's not so serious. And then there's those that accept impacts. And although those who accept these two things, they're going to say, well, but I don't think there's anything we can do about it. And that's what we call response skepticism. So I'm going to just talk about these a little bit now. Here's the diagram I showed you earlier. So let's start out with the skeptic about anthropogenic global heating. The kind of person who says, yeah, it's heating up. I can see there's global warming going on, but it's natural. Okay, now why is it natural? I mean, what else is there? Well, they'll say it's the sun. The sun is brighter, the sun is hotter. Well, that's just not true. So you can see that temperature has increased particularly lately in this period here, exactly at a time when actually the radiance from the sun is actually a little bit less than usual. Also, climate scientists can run models across time, say going back to 1860. These are kind of big physics models that have like, 1 mile cubes of the whole planet, and you put all these differential equations in for every possible thing to do with CO2 concentrations and emissions from volcanoes and ocean acidification, and just model the whole thing and run the model. And obviously, if your model is very good, the temperature estimated by your model is going to match actual observed temperatures, right? And I don't have time to elaborate this whole thing. I'm not an expert on this topic, but the bottom line is that it's only if you add the human factors. You've got to add human-generated CO2 emissions to actually get the model to match the actual temperatures. If you leave the human stuff out, it just can't. And that includes volcanoes and ocean acidification. Every possible factor that skeptics want to say is buried in the model will not give you the actual temperatures unless you add the human cause factors. All right, someone's going to say, it's heating up, it's human caused, but it's nothing to worry about. All right. Why do they say it's nothing to worry about? Well, climate has changed massively in the past. I mean, we know there were ice ages and intergalactic things. There were dinosaurs that came and went and so forth. And it's true that it has changed massively in the past. Okay, let's look at that. So you can people drill ice cores in the Arctic, deep down about, three clicks deep. And you can extract the little bubbles that go back 800,000 years. And so you can actually work out what carbon dioxide was going back 800,000 years. And then there's isotope methods for estimating what the temperature was. So what we see is we see temperature over here and carbon dioxide over here, and we see 800,000 years before the present, and then it's kind of been truncated here because you can't represent it like that. But here we go up to 2020, okay? And so we see that temperature is red and carbon dioxide is blue. And indeed, they've gone up and down fairly tightly locked over long time periods, and it's fluctuates. So it's true that climate has varied in the past quite substantially. However, okay, notice a few things. The level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere right now, which is currently about 416 parts per million, 416, is higher than at any point in the last 800,000 years. This varied from about 180 to 280. And in fact, there's other methods that can take us back 3 million years. We're higher than at any point in the last 3 million years, 0.1. Second, the increase that's occurred has been extremely rapid. It's occurred in the last 200 years, which is since the Industrial Revolution, since we started really, burning the fossil fuels. Whereas any changes that have happened across time here have occurred over thousands of years. And by the way, these up and down changes are due to the fact that the Earth doesn't go around the sun in a completely symmetrical fashion. There's some ellipsis to it. So this is the intergalactic periods are due to that. So, you know, it's true that climate is varied, but it has never gone up to levels of 416 parts per million in 3 million years. And it's never changed this rapidly. Now, the really scary thing, people, is that temperature is going to go with it. Because you can see these things are locked together. There's thermal inertia in the oceans. It's going to take a while for temperature to go with it. But if we carry on and keep our levels at 416, and by the way, we just keep adding all the time, temperature is going to, you know, temperature is going exponential, by the way. All right. So anyway, that's so much for that argument. Now, another version of this argument, it's heating up, it's human caused, but there's nothing to worry about, is the argument that, you know, there's going to be some benefits to global heating. And I find this utterly preposterous, but people say these things. Oh, okay, so there's some benefits. One of them is that the crop season will be lengthened in some ways. So for example, in the United States, it's already been lengthened by about 12 days. And parts of Russia are excited about this because they didn't previously have crops. Now they can have crops. Okay, fine. All right, there's a tiny benefit there. That doesn't countenance the fact that the devastation on actual plants, on the coffee industry, on what's happening right now, by the way, in India, maybe Hannah is from India, I don't know, I'm just guessing. You know, the disruption of human agriculture, the decimation of the livelihoods of the poorest billions of people in frontline communities in the global south, the species extinction, I mean, the colossal impacts of this could somehow be improved or weighted by like an increased growing season is preposterous. Another argument is given is that the Arctic will be ice-free, and so there will be international shipping trade that will go through the Arctic. What a great benefit of global heating. In fact, that will accelerate our predicament, since about 2 to 3% of all the emissions are from shipping. We'll just have more international shipping. So the idea that the benefits outweighing the cost is really preposterous. All right, skeptic number 3. I accept it's human caused. I accept the impacts are going to be severe. Now they are, and they're going to be very severe in the next few decades. But you know what? It's not cost effective to solve it, cost effectiveness. This is a long story to get into this, but I want to really say in the end, my analysis of this, or the analysis of this, isn't really about dollars. This is about our values, right? I mean, if you think you can put an estimate on the costs of the damage by 2100 to losing most of the large animals, to submerging many islands under rising oceans, the property damage in Florida from rising oceans, the impact on several billion. I'm going to show you some of the impacts on people by 2050 and 2070. 3 billion people are going to be exposed to mean annual temperatures of 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 84 degrees Fahrenheit. The notion that you can put like a dollar amount on that and kind of say it's not worth it to solve it now is just preposterous. And I think it's very well summarized by this quote attributed to Larry Summers. Some of you may know Larry Summers, since you're at Rutgers. He was the president of Harvard and great, you know, World Bank. The existence value, says Larry Summers, of species is irrelevant. I don't care about ants except for drugs. This is not to beat on Larry Summers personally, but this kind of mentality that everything in the world has dollar amounts just excludes what is really a question of fundamental values of our responsibility to planet Earth and the people on it, and future generations that are not born. All right. Now, another aspect of response skepticism that I want to touch on here isn't really about the cost. It's the thing where you may feel this, and probably most people you know do, where you sort of go, oh my God, this is so terrifying. This is so enormous. There's nothing we can do, right? This kind of feeling of hopelessness and nihilism and just despair at the prospect, which is a lot of what people do when they look away. They don't even want to think about it or talk about it. Luna is nodding sagely in response to what I'm saying. Yes. Well, you know, this is a whole long story that actually connects with the topic of the psychology of collective action, which maybe we can talk more about. And there's a lot to say about why is it that some of us like me don't feel that? Why is it that we have psychological and sociological factors pushing us to really want to act and other people don't? That's an extremely important question. I'm very interested in that question. I just want to say in passing here that, you know, the notion that we can't do anything about this flies in the face of just about everything we've ever known about human history. Right? You never get anything without collective action struggle and social struggle, whether it was gay rights or MLK and the civil rights movement, or these are the climate justice movement at UC San Diego, or the 8-hour workday, or the 5-day work week, or anti-apartheid. It's not as if people said to the bosses and the capitalists, hey, you know, we'd really like an 8-hour workday. Sure, fine, there you go. Everything that we've got, every aspect of the protections in society and the protections of the planet, the protections of our labor, are fought through social struggle. The idea that we're skeptical about the prospects of this when we're facing one of the greatest predicaments in human history is really not consistent, I think. And on this point, I think it's nice to quote the environmentalist Wendell Berry here. Now, I like this a lot. We don't have a right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have a right to ask is, what is the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? I really like that, right? This idea that, no, we can't bother doing anything because we're not going to succeed. It's too big. That defies the fact that that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Don't think about it in terms of whether we're going to succeed. Think about it in terms of what we need to do. Okay, so impacts, all right? If we look at the United States in 2020, this is from NOAA, the government agency, it points out that we had 22 separate billion-dollar weather and extreme disasters. So 22 events cost $1 billion last year in the US alone. And as many of you know, we had these incredible fires in California, Oregon, and Washington State. I don't know what the cost of that is right now, but the last time it happened, it was $150 billion. This is going to be more. So just one summer in the Pacific Northwest in California has produced damage that would probably be $150 billion. And this is going to happen again and again. Now, the problem is we have to be careful to distinguish weather from climate. We've got to be very careful. Even when we look at this huge freeze that happened in Texas and much of the country, maybe you guys were even part of that, I don't know. You know, it's a tricky thing for climate attribution experts to attribute particular extreme weather events. So you can do it. It's called attribution science, and it's getting better, but it's always couched in terms of climate change increases the likelihood, frequency, intensity. It's hard to kind of attribute any particular event. And I think the way to think about this is like a distribution, right? If you think of a distribution, like we've got all the males here and all the females, if we pull one male out, that male will tend to be higher than the females, right? It's like the climate is the statistics of weather. Weather is an event you pull out. So if we were here and we had, you know, this distribution of temperature, for example, and then you have climate change, you shift the whole distribution to the right, which means that if you pick out any particular day or any particular year, it's more likely to be hot. Okay, that's how we just think about climate. It's like climate change is weather on steroids, right? Did she win the 100-meter race because she's a good athlete, or did she win it because she took steroids? Well, the answer is she's a good athlete and she took steroids, right? The steroids made her a better athlete. It exaggerates and draws things out. So we need to look at statistics across time. We need to look at trends. Well, let's look at some trends. So here is the extreme weather events in the world from 1971 until 2010, and obviously we have more now. 400% increase of extreme weather events. Floods, mass movement, storms, droughts, extreme weather, wildfires, so forth. So this is data across time, right? This is trends, 400% increase of extreme weather events. And, you know, this is a paper from Bioscience, 11,000 earth scientists were authors on this paper. This was 2019. I just find this astonishing, right? This is the sad and radical truth that the planet is blinking red on every single indicator you could look at. Carbon dioxide is at 416 parts per million. So that's the 1980 to 2010. 2020 is the time period, and it's using this time period. Methane is right up, nitrous oxide is up, surface temperature, as we've seen, is about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 Fahrenheit relative to pre-industrial levels. Arctic sea ice is down, Greenland ice mass is down, and Arctic ice mass is down, glacier thickness is down. Extreme weather events have increased 400% from about 200 in 1980 to 800 here, the hydro events they've measured. Ocean is getting more acidified, sea level is increasing, and the area of burn in the United States goes up and up and up. Okay, so some of those impacts are already here. Now let's look at 2050. This, of course, is a prediction, obviously, and it's relying on, I don't have time to explain all this to you. There's different pathways when we ask, you know, how much is temperature going to go up? There's different RCP pathways from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and scientists. And RCP 8.5 is business as usual, all right? So you could say, well, that's not realistic. We're not going to be emitting as much as we are now in 2050, okay? I don't know why you would say that, but you're confident that there's a big transition going to happen soon. But let's just project it and say we're on business as usual, all right? If we stay on business as usual until 2050, the likelihood of a lethal heat wave in areas of India and Pakistan, so these areas of India and Pakistan, will become 40% in any single year. Now, a lethal heat wave is a 3-day period with a wet bulb temperature of 34 Celsius. One more degree than that and you die in the shade, right? If some of you may have read Kim Stanley Robinson's new book, Ministry for the Future, chapter 1 is basically a heat wave in India that dramatizes the scenario. So, this is not science fiction. Like this is the kind of models we have of what will happen if we stay on our pathway in 2050. Now, maybe you could say everyone in India or Pakistan will have air conditioners. All right. And this, by the way, is not some leftist environmental maniacs. This is McKinsey Consulting. Nobody does data like capitalism, okay? This is McKinsey Consulting's projection. All right, let's look at 2070. So this is a PNAS, Prestigious National Academy of Science papers, Tim Lenton from Exeter University. It's pointing out that planet Earth right now, that for millennia, people have basically occupied this zone, okay? And in the zone, the mean annual temperature is about in -11 to 15 Celsius. That there's only a few tiny little spots in the Sahara Desert, and I don't know if this is Somalia and maybe Djibouti or something. These tiny little black spots here are parts of the Earth right now where the mean annual temperature is 29 Celsius, which is 84 Fahrenheit. So the mean temperature for the whole year is 84 Fahrenheit, okay? That's 0.8% of the Earth's surface has that temperature, okay? Now, what is going to happen in 2070 if we stay on business as usual is that 1 to 3 billion people, this entire zone that you see stippled over here, will be exposed to mean annual temperatures of 29 Celsius, which is 84 Fahrenheit, right? I mean, this is in your lifetime, our lifetimes. I'm going to be alive then? No, I'm not, but you'll still be alive. So my children will. I mean, it's not that far away. And the consequences of this to socio-political stability, to any, this is why the US military, has talked about climate change as the greatest risk, and that was even under the Trump administration. Like, if people understand the implications of borders and conflict and migration that's going to ensue. All right, so I'm getting to the end here. So social science. So here's about me, not that I'm a narcissist, but I just wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm at UC San Diego, psychology, and I've kind of shifted, actually. Let me show you this next slide. So I actually just changed my webpage last week. So and David Zold will probably identify with the problem I have is that, I've been a sort of cognitive psychologist and neuroscientist all my career. And so I maintain that. I have NIH grants, and I can't reorient that research to deal with this. It has nothing to do with it. So I've sort of started adding, basically a climate psychology lab very recently with some lovely people. And I've sort of starting to develop these two different kinds of strands where I carry on doing the basic neuroscience research and I start doing some research on the social science of climate crisis. Okay, now in the last few minutes, I want to touch on a few things here. First of all, so this is showing us the UN negotiations, Kyoto. And this figure I pulled from somewhere else, so I'm not going to explain this whole thing. But I simply want to point out here that, I think one doesn't really get involved in being an activist and a climate crisis activist, or maybe even doing this kind of work on the psychology of climate crisis, if you have it depends on your theory of change. So if you think that the Biden administration is going to take care of it, you just need to get the Democrats in and they're going to take care of it. If you think that the internet, that we're back in the Paris Accords now and they're going to be international binding treaties and it's being taken care of by politicians, then you're not going to do anything. But if you develop appropriate levels of skepticism that this is a completely bankrupt process, both at the international level, that's accomplished absolutely nothing, okay, except some basic measurement and voluntary declarations. And if you arrive at the conclusion that national policy is not going to happen anytime soon without a very big push from the grassroots, then you'll be, ready to do climate action. You're ready to be an activist. And I've arrived at that position. Like, I have zero confidence that the political systems anywhere can deal with this. They will ultimately have to, and they're going to have to deal with it soon, this decade. But they're going to need some serious push from below. And we know that's true for a number of reasons. Biden did not sign the Keystone XL blockage. He didn't sign the banning on federal lands because for nothing, on his own, like nice volition, being a corporate Democrat. He was pushed by the Sunrise Movement. He was pushed by 350. He was pushed by tens of thousands of young people that helped get AOC elected. You know all of this. I mean, there's a lot of visible influence of the climate movement now on the policy that's being done, and there will be more. All right. So back to this thing over here. Here's a sort of analysis of how I think about the psychology side. We need two kinds of research. We need research to figure out how to bolster the believers. This is more of a science communication and threat perception, and I can talk about this in a moment. There's a number of things that we can do and research we can do to figure out how to change people's beliefs, okay? Including something like 45% of adult Americans that don't believe it's human caused, and lots of people who believe it's human caused but don't believe the impacts are severe. And even people, yeah. And then the second problem we have is shifting people from believing that this is serious to actually feeling efficacious, feeling that they want to join action. So I'll point out here that, and I don't say this in a pejorative kind of, morally superior way, but just to say that I think most of the people we know, certainly most of the people I know in the UCSD and around, and the professor friends and other friends we have, are in this category of accepting all of these things, but I'd call them in the little action category. They'll look at it to some extent. They'll read about it in the New York Times. They'll, if they're profs, they'll like buy electric cars and proudly drive them around and put solar panels on their roofs. And some people will change their diet. These are good things. I don't want to knock them, but they'll stop there. And yet a very small fraction of people will go way beyond that. And they will look at it. They will grieve. If you haven't really grieved and sobbed, I don't think you've really looked at it. They will talk about and be climate crisis communicators, and they will engage in a myriad actions that I would call collective action, right? It's not you on your own. If you sit in your house all alone and you cut out the red meat because you're concerned that animal agriculture is 13 to 80% of emissions, okay, good for you, but it's going to have no influence on the world. But if you tell your parents and your family and your friends that, I'm cutting out the red meat, I'm going to have it once a year now because I'm doing this because of the climate crisis, and you politicize your behavior, you're part of collective action, and that's where the action is. That's what's going to make a difference. So we sort of need to understand how to shift people from here to over here. And I'll sort of end, I think this is the last slide I have. This is the last slide? Yeah, almost, okay. I'm teaching a class about this right now. Actually, I've done it several times. This is the teaching I'm doing. This is the structure of my class, by the way. And I want to just go through this a little bit because this leads to, more of a psychology discussion we can have, because there's so much that could be said about these different things. So I start out in a way with the background of heating and James Hansen testifying to Congress and, when the greenhouse gas thing was discovered and so forth. I talk about climate science. You just saw a little bit of that right now and the impacts. You saw a bit of that. I discuss a very significant issue of how the climate crisis is related to elements of capitalism, particularly the neoliberal version, but going way back before, and to do with human domination of nature and even concepts in Christianity. And then I move into the second part of the class is this thing I talked about, bolstering the believers. And the third part of the class down here is from belief to action. So this is the part that, is perhaps most pertinent to our discussion, and what you're interested in is cognitive sciences. These are much more psychological topics. Motivated cognition and the rejection of science. How do people arrive at their beliefs, whether it's anti-vax or anti-climate, climate denial? How do you shift people's beliefs using various techniques of in-group messaging and so forth? Sort of getting to the underlying values and attitudes, like what, there's a psychology concepts there. Science communication, communicating uncertainty, communicating mechanism, empowering people with basic mechanistic understanding much increases their confidence, teaching them about consensus. How do you communicate the science in this way? A topic we were touching on earlier, threat perception, risk perception. I think this is an extremely significant factor in who joins climate movements. Everybody I know in the climate movement and the climate justice movement is traumatized, I would say. Every 18, 19, 20-year-old undergrad is basically in shock and traumatized. But people have a altered barrier of threat perception, and they sort of understand the implications, and they're dealing with that by being part of collective action. It makes them feel better. And so there's a whole bunch of issues about risk perception. Does extreme weather change beliefs? Or, a whole bunch of issues there. And then this whole topic of eco-psychology and climate grief, sort of dealing with eco-anxiety, and topic of eco-psychology, which is, to elaborate, I can't do that right now, but to sort of our views of nature and how we have different views of nature and where those views come from and how those connect back to capitalism. The last part here is really the belief to action part. And this is the psychology and sociology of collective action, which I alluded to earlier. It's extremely important, I think. You know, I'm trying to research that. I think there's limits to what we can learn from science about political change, honestly. You know, it's a mysterious thing. But there are certain factors that can be attributed: social norms, collective efficacy, theory of change, biospheric values. I can give you a long list of like 10 factors that are surely important. And some people have them strongly and some people have them weakly. And understanding, you know, how they work and what constellations to drive people to want to act is, I think, a very important psychological topic. And then there's things I get into about climate justice, which is very significant, sort of thinking about our predicament not as a technical problem to be solved by technology, right? But to think of this as fundamentally about social systems, right? And social systems are going to have to solve it. And this infuses everything. I mean, people say, oh yeah, it's pointless doing anything. China emits so much. Now there's a climate justice concept embedded in there, which is, it's true that China emits a lot right now. China actually emits more than the United States, but not per capita. And certainly not if you take an historical perspective. If you take a historical perspective back to the Industrial Revolution, per capita emissions from an American are 300 tons of carbon each. And from China, it's about 40. So we're 10 times more than any Chinese, okay? So if you want to start talking about, we don't need to do anything because China's emitting so much, that's a preposterous thing to say if you take a climate justice perspective, right? And climate justice is extremely significant. I was explaining to students yesterday in my class, many of our institutions, University of California, Google, Apple, say they're going to be carbon neutral. We're so great. UC is a climate leader. Well, you look at what is carbon neutrality. It's a complete bullshit concept that basically means we continue to burn methane gas on our campus, emit 1 million tons of CO2 per year, and we're going to buy cook stoves in East Africa. And those people in East Africa are going to have our cook stoves and wood pellets and not chop down their trees, and we're just going to carry on. Seriously, like you need to think about that seriously. This reliance on market mechanisms and technical things like pulling carbon dioxide out of the air are often excuses to actually not deal with what we have to deal with, which is we have to confront the fossil fuel industry and we have to stop burning fossil fuels quickly. Leads to political considerations. A Green New Deal, I don't fetishize a Green New Deal, but it is a significant thing to look at because it's a social democratic vision going back to FDR. No matter what you call it, and Biden doesn't want to call it a Green New Deal, whether it's the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese, or us, there's going to have to be very large government stimulus and radical reorientation of the kind we saw under FDR, that kind of social democrat, that we have to have that eventually. It's not enough. There are going to be things that are going to happen alongside that, but we're going to need something like that. And finally, I analyze the climate movement, whether it's 350, Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, or Greta, and look at kind of what those things are. So that's the end there. And when we have about 23 minutes or something to discuss, so sorry for rattling on so much.
Feel free to add your questions in the chat too. We can read them out.
So a quick question about how you study response control. So I know you study response control. I think I just got a quick glimpse from the website and from some of the reading I did by going on your website a bit earlier. You study response control in mice, and do you think that individualistic study really has a grasp on how big the climate crisis is in terms of denial in terms of larger populations? Like, do you think studying at the individual level is, beneficial or equally as beneficial as studying entire populations, or as you said, studying social psychology and studying whole groups?
Aron, sorry, I'm a bit confused. So the mice is a very small part of what I do. That's a collaborative work, mostly studying humans with cognitive psychology paradigms in the lab. So sorry, just to elaborate again. So how's your question related to sort of your preamble about I study response control in the lab?
So I should have elaborated on that. I was under the impression that your study on response control was related somehow to I guess
To all of this.
yes.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's not.
Okay.
And we have some experimental psychologists and David Zald here, so maybe they can contradict me, but I don't think it is. I think that's a fanciful and ludicrous notion. No offense to you, that there's no way to marry neuroscience with the climate crisis. I don't think so. I mean, someone wants to persuade me otherwise, and I think there's very little way to marry sort of typical cognitive psychology. I mean, there are domains of cognitive psychology that might be relevant, but not the typical button press task in the lab. So yeah, no, I see this as really separate kinds of strands.
Thank you.
Sure.
I actually had a question about the numbers, and so you showed us like the different graphs of like carbon dioxide emissions, and even there are other graphs of like the Milankovitch cycles that kind of dictate how the climate works, and we're not really exposed to that. But when you look at other crises like the pandemic, you're exposed to the numbers a lot more, like how many cases and like how many deaths. So is there a reason why we aren't always showed the numbers when we think about climate change? We only think about like extreme weather conditions. Is there like value to knowing the numbers, or should we just, fear for extreme weather events, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, I'm not an oracle on this, right? It's just my opinion. Like, it's not like I have some, it's not like I'm a world expert climate crisis communicator. But honestly, I think we've got to get over our like lack of knowledge about. I mean, we don't have to be atmospheric physicists or atmospheric chemists or like feel very confident because we took a class in earth sciences. I mean, I think we should be empowered by knowledge of the greenhouse gas effect and some basic facts, and confident that the intergovernmental panel IPCC 2018 report, backed by all the world's governments, right, said we have to cut emissions by 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels. I mean, we got the Paris Accord. There's no question that all governments basically support dramatic action. They're just not doing it. There's no question that it's a consensus amongst climate scientists. I think to the extent that one equips oneself with a bit of scientific knowledge enough to, for example, refute some skeptics in your family about sunspots or whatever bullshit argument they come up with, that's a good thing. But I think, honestly, I think this is past climate science and earth science. Like, okay, they can keep on measuring how fast the glaciers are melting and keep making projections and looking at error bars into the future. Okay, fine. Launching satellites and measuring carbon dioxide in the ocean, carry on. But I think for the rest of us, this is about social science. This is about human behavior and culture change. This is about the biggest problem we've ever faced. And, this is a disruption to organized human existence in the next few decades. And time is running out in a way it wasn't when I was a grad student. I remember 2002, 2003, I was kind of worried about it. Maybe I should do something. My God, it's changed. I mean, it's become clear that temperature rise is exponential. And it's become in our living room now. We look at the California fires, look at the Texas deep freeze, we look at what's happening all over the world repeatedly. And the notion of exponential increase of extreme weather events is like right here now. So, if that sort of answers your question, Hannah, I mean, I think equipping oneself with more science is always a good thing. And one can equip oneself with more facts about, climate facts and climate science. But honestly, unless you're kind of battling with skeptics of various kinds, and you want to be a little bit more grounded and you want to be more of a communicator, I think it's really shifting to thinking about this at a social science level. And just to say on that point, I saw a paper that heretofore 0.2% of all the research funding in the United States has been allocated to climate change went to social science, 0.2%. For what is basically a problem of social, psychological, and sociological change, right? So that needs to change. And I think one way that needs to change, to David's point about the neuroscientists at Vanderbilt, is, younger generations need to get interested, are interested in this. They need to be, we should be facilitating research of this topic. And again, I don't want to make out too much about cognitive science and psychology, some magic bullet here, but I think it's significant for the reasons I laid out. It's part of our solution.
One of the things that comes to mind, which pulls into my own family background, my father was an expert on social movements. He was a sociologist.
Oh, wow.
And it seems to me there's a lot to be said to pulling in sociology of understanding what it is that allows a social movement to take off, what allows it to actually have to pull in the resources it needs to engender a change.
Absolutely, I totally agree. In fact, I think Zold came up in my reading, so I actually had that connection in my mind, and that's good to know.
Yeah, that's my dad.
Yeah, I think the other is McAdam from Stanford. Your dad must surely know McAdam, right? He's the guy who studied the freedom, the white people who came from northern states and went and joined the civil rights movement and the Freedom Summer and so forth. And so he studied those phenomena. So yes, David, I think that's correct. I mean, it's a curious thing though, because, for example, where I am, and my understanding is very few sociologists actually focused on this, as are very few social psychologists. I have some social psychologists in my department, and I was talking to one of them in 2019 before the pandemic. He just came back from a social psychology conference somewhere, and I said, well, did you see any posters about climate change? He said, no. And I went and looked with him on the website. There were 2,000 abstracts. One of them had anything to do with climate change. I mean, this is a threat to organized human existence within the next few decades, and the field of social psychology has like 1 out of 2,000 abstracts on it. So there's something very strange going on, and I think it's to do with, and we can speculate on that, but I mean, I think it's to do with people staying in their own lane, and thinking that this is some kind of political topic. It's like, well, you better get with that quickly now, and I think that it's coming a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's also, the topic of social movements is very interesting. How much can we retrieve from prior social movements, insights and lessons for understanding better this? And I would hope we can, although some people are skeptical. So Frances Fox Piven, who's a famous sociologist at Columbia, wrote Poor People's Movements. And I think her view is that this is completely unpredictable. Like all the great explosion, if you look at Black Lives Matters lately, obviously the George Floyd thing triggered the latest instantiation, but no one could have predicted that. Right. So, from the kind of science we do as cognitive scientists or neuroscientists or experimental psychologists like William Hellman here, I mean, we're used to kind of controlled conditions and creating like models. And when we move to the domain of human social stuff, I think it's very hard. But I think you're right, David. I think there should be insights from that we can use.
So, okay, I have another question. Going along with, you said there was almost a ladder of steps when it comes to accepting the climate crisis, and I feel like I just have one question about, I guess, the role of desensitization and where it falls, within that ladder. You mentioned that for, I guess, step 3, meaning people accept the climate crisis but refuse to make any significant change. Where does the role of desensitization and just the insane amount of information that people are now used to processing, where does that come into play, and how do you think that can be effectively combated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what you're saying is, when you say desensitization, you just mean, like you just said at the end, like there's so many things that are concerning people right now. Why should they focus on this? Yeah.
That and also more just, I guess the significance of every insane event that is caused by this crisis has become less significant because it's happening in such great frequency.
Well, so that's what's called shifting baseline. So that's a different form of desensitization. It's very interesting. Okay. So there's this a climate journalist called David Roberts who writes in Vox. Some of you might want to check him out. He's really good. And he had a piece recently on what he called shifting baselines. There's actually an empirical paper in Proceedings of the National Academy 2019 that got the entire Twitter database for the United States from 2014 to, this is kind of cognitive science research you could do. The entire Twitter database from 2014 to 2016 for the whole US, about 4 billion tweets, geolocated to every single county, along with the weather, the temperature at the weekly level at every county. So they can basically regress temperature against Twitter mentions of weather, right? And they can sort of ask what happens. And the bottom line from that paper is very discouraging. It says that if people in a particular location like experience temperature anomalies of 5 or 6 Fahrenheit several years in a row in the month of June, they basically just stop tweeting about it. right? And the same with cold. So 4 or 5 years of extreme weather in a row, and people just stop remarking on it anymore. And that fits our experience under the pandemic, right? So people have pointed out, like, we're having still 3,000 deaths a day. That's like a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor every single day. And it's just like kind of unremarkable. And if that had happened right at the beginning, it would have been like a terrorist attack or something, right? So this is, we kind of adapt and we adjust. And I think that's, Ayan, your question is right to that. I think this is a problem. You know, a lot of people keep saying, oh my God, Americans are going to wake up when the extreme weather gets to them. I don't know if they will. Yeah, and Luna's shaking her head. And I think it's more complicated than that paper, because I think the paper is like, again, this is the science we do. We make things very simple. We isolate a few variables. And in reality, it's not like there's just temperature. There's not heat. There's storms, there's the deep freeze. The real world has a lot more stuff going on. And so it might be the combination is important. But I think there is a desensitization going on. It's like the fishermen caught less and less fish each generation, and the ones that were born thought those were the amount of fish they were, right? So that is something we're working against. To your other point, Ayan, I think it's a good one. You know, I think young people, particularly undergrads and the ones I know, you know, that some of them, I mean, I'm not at Princeton where they all have silver spoons in their mouths, if that's what they have. I mean, the UCSD students are pretty modest from their background, right? A lot of them are frontline workers. They're working in restaurants and stuff, and they're in school and taking 16 credits, probably like some of you. And they don't have time to be jumping in the climate movement and volunteering their time to save their planet. And lots of people, particularly poorer people and people of color in the US, are not going to be able to do that. And so that gets a little bit to your concern as well. I think that in answer to this, there are great efforts underway right now to kind of align climate action with environmental justice or environmental injustice. And this whole idea that you're going to make a broad, this gets to David's point about social movements. You want a very broad front social movement that basically brings people in alliance. So the indigenous, for example, will protest the Keystone, or not the Dakota Access Pipeline, which Biden is still, you know, not blocked, right? And they're not protesting. I don't think they're protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline because they're worried necessarily about emissions. They're worried about their water supplies, right? So there we go, Ayan. It's like there's a tie-in. Like they will come out and they will ally with, you know, a whole bunch of college students and white people and others who come and join them, who are there for emissions and the biosphere, and you have an alliance. And so I think this is a frame. I think this is a really significant issue, is you've got to find ways to frame this. And you can even find ways to frame it to make it appealing to Republicans and conservatives to some extent. They're probably not going to advocate for this because of climate change per se, but they will advocate for national security interests. They will advocate for the co-benefits of jobs. And some of them, like Catholics, for example, who could be quite conservative politically, will have a stewardship mentality in their kind of Christianity, like they actually care about the planet. And I think, you know, part of the riddle here is to find ways to make it important to lots of people.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to comment, I guess, more on something than ask a question, because I wasn't really sure if I really had a question to ask, but like I was just thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and like desensitization. And it's interesting to see that like we've had so many big like global or like national disasters like the wildfires last year, and how recently the Texas like cold frost. But like what triggered like the Black Lives Matter movement mostly was the George Floyd thing. But like for us, like for the climate change movement, stuff like that, like there's been so many big events that have happened, but there's been no like desire to like protest or like have any change based off of it. So I kind of wonder like what point do we have to reach in order for us to be like, oh my God, we actually have to do something about this, like how we did for Black Lives Matter movement. I don't really think there's an answer to it. I just think it's interesting and just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, others may want to pipe in there. I mean, I think a couple of things. Number one is, you know, I mean, it's true that the George Floyd event was a trigger, but that movement was around since 2016, actually, under the Obama movement. And it has its roots in deeper injustices and deeper movements going back to civil rights movement and so forth. So there's sort of, you know, this is important, I think, to recognize. A lot of people think, you know, this is all about protesting. A lot of the undergrads, I think, here think, oh, you know, not everyone wants to protest. I mean, not all of us want to go out there and, you know, make a fuss and make a noise. And some people are quiet or shy, or they want to be involved in other ways. I think protest is the sort of tip of the whole thing. It's the organizing and the social media and the education and the you know, all that kind of, and those movements, even the BLM was simmering away, and people were putting a lot of hard work in. So then, you know, to some extent it can season that event. you know, Greta Thunberg is just one person, and we don't want to fetishize her, but you know, she certainly became a sort of touchstone of international youth movement, and that was going very well until the pandemic. I mean, I think we saw in September 2019, you know, 7 million people came out in late September all over the world, and that was just growing, right? So the youth movements and the climate justice movements, and I think that will, you know, it's hard under the pandemic. There's a lot of kind of virtual organizing going on, but you know, to your point, Luna, I mean, I think, you know, one day it will look like the Vietnam War protests, but it might be quite late. And the problem with the Vietnam War protests is you know, the young men didn't want to go and die in Indochina. I mean, some of them had an ideological objection, but mostly that was it. You know, it was some self-interest, but eventually it became so big and so massive and such a rallying thing that it became sort of impossible to ignore politically. And I think the climate movement will get there, but the problem is we're sort of in a race against time now. You know, the point, and to Ayan's point about desensitization, shifting baselines, the point when it is so dramatic and it is so concerning and so linked is kind of gets late. I don't think there's any such thing as too late. We're going to have 1.5 degrees now, no matter what we do, and we're probably going to have it in 2030. But we don't have to have 2 degrees, and we don't have 2.2 and 2.4 and 2.6. Any fraction of a degree we stave off is going to be hugely significant for species and for, you know, people, particularly global south. And we can turn the emissions down. It's not impossible to imagine. So kind of waiting for that big mass movement, you know, like to Luna's point, I don't know if we can. Something in chat. The desensitization is accompanied by polarized extremes, though. Yeah, I don't know what you mean.
I guess just sort of abstractly thinking that so with the sheer amount of data, people might feel sort of hopeless, but I guess there's also people that would, I guess, be called like climate deniers, or those I don't know. I don't have like
that's okay.
Articulated.
Don't worry. It's fine. You know, Ayan came up with a very good point, and others please pipe up as well. And I keep coming back to sort of what he said there about sort of how do you know, people are so busy with other stuff and so overburdened with other stuff that, you know, that's a very significant thing. And I'll be careful saying this because I don't want to sound like some, you know, mad leftist or something. Heaven forbid. And not everyone is going to have the same entry points. But I think that, you know, you probably heard of Naomi Klein, right? And so she wrote a great book called This Changes Everything, which is just an amazing book, really. I mean, I don't agree with her on everything, but it's very good. And Naomi Klein describes how she just didn't give a shit about this. In fact, she was in a form of denial, is the way she put it. Up to 2009, she was just enjoying her elite travel status and business class trips around the world and feeling very special to be invited everywhere and being a social justice warrior, right? And she didn't want to know about climate change. And she sort of had this epiphany when she was talking to this Bolivian indigenous activist who kind of explained to her how dramatic this was. And Naomi Klein had an epiphany because she suddenly realized, like, the stuff she wants in the world, she wants a more just and equitable society, which is not run by, you know, corporations and takes better care of people, is exactly what's going to have to happen to deal with this. So I think, Ayan, to your point, you know, I think a lot of, you know, 55% of young Americans basically don't think socialism is a dirty word anymore. I mean, I don't know what they think socialism means. They don't mean Stalinism. They mean some kind of Bernie Sanders type thing, which is just basically social democracy in a European model. Like, a lot of young people have cottoned on to the fact that this is a highly unequal society, that you've been inherited a poison chalice, that things are really stacked against you, that 3 men have as much wealth as the bottom 50%, and that this is rotten. This is some bad shit, plus the institutional racism and the whole thing. So we need a lot of fixing. We need a lot of social fixing. And I think it's very linked to the climate crisis because we're going to have to do these things together. And so that's a hopeful thing. You know, it has to get linked in people's minds that, you know, advocating for getting off the fossil fuels and moving to an alternative energy regime and all the stuff that entails and the jobs that entails is actually consistent with a social vision. And that's not a dirty piece of communism or something. It's just a very sane, you know, kind of what the country needs. And so, you know, making those links and tying that together, I think, is pretty valuable.
I do want to make another comment, but I just want to make sure that no one else has any questions. So please do speak up if you do.
I actually have a question. Oh, sorry.
Oh, Michelle, go ahead. Oh, and Cynthia. Was it Cynthia? All right. You said you're in the stack, Cynthia.
I kind of wanted to ask, was there any like government or country that you think is making adequate progress towards the climate crisis or is doing the right thing that maybe left a positive impression on you so far?
So, you know, it's all a bit tricky because, okay, so a country like Denmark is doing well. Denmark has no fossil fuel exportation, and they're small and they're fairly rich already, and they can actually run most of Denmark on wind power, some days 100%, some days 40%, and they can be nice and virtuous and start replacing their buses with electric. And so if we really look at Denmark in isolation, okay, fine, they're doing well, but they're very atypical. If you look at Norway, you know, by 2025, nearly 100% of new car sales in Norway will be electric. Everyone's driving around these electric cars now. They're generating 100% of their electricity from wind and hydropower, and it looks fantastic. Meanwhile, Norway is a huge fossil fuel exporter, right? That's their main income. Britain is touted as having reduced its emissions, I think, to 1990 levels now. It looks fantastic, okay? The issue is, how do you count emissions? Britain counts its emissions in terms of the production of emissions, but actually Britain is a very high importer of goods, for example, from China. And the embodied emissions and the products from China that are being consumed by Britons gives them an incredibly high carbon dioxide emission, but that doesn't count because only territorial emissions, because of climate justice concept. So the US looks like its emissions are going down, but we basically outsourced jobs to China, so they're doing the emissions for us. So where's Michelle gone? The large countries, the significant countries, are really not doing it yet. Obviously, there's positive signs. Obviously, things are moving much more in the right direction now. Obviously, we're on the cusp of something. So it's not all doom and gloom, but you know, fundamentally, there are serious impediments to dealing with this. You know, and when Greta Thunberg goes to the UN and says, "I can't believe you're evil," she's saying, "I'm perplexed why you know the facts and you won't act." And the answer is like, it's extremely inconvenient for politicians to reduce emissions. It's going to run up against, you know, standard operating modes. So yeah, Michelle, I'm not very impressed by any big country because they're not doing it yet.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, there was Cynthia. Yeah, go ahead.
Wait, I know you talked about in like the slides you showed the diagram of like most people are like, they recognize that there needs to, that something needs to be done, and I forgot what it was exactly, but it was like recognizing that something needs to be done. There was like the group on the left, which was like they do their own personal actions, and then there's the other group that does the collective action and other stuff. So I was wondering if there was like any research, or do you know anything about like if there's, I guess, like research into more, I guess, effective ways of communicating like how urgent the matter is, like, and like, I guess, like, combating desensitization and like fake news and other stuff like that. I was wondering if there's any like research done in like, I guess, like more effective communication in regards to like convincing people to act more.
To act more, yeah. So So a general comment on this, and maybe William will correct me, I don't know, but my general assessment is most of the research that's been done up until now hasn't really been adequate to what we really need, right? A lot of it has been online surveys or large studies. And so it comes on large studies asking people about their attitudes and their beliefs and kind of hypothetical surveys being filled out. And really what we need to do is we need to understand people's real world behavior. We need to kind of sample them across time, and we need to understand what the factors are that shift them, and we need to measure whether their behavior changes. And I'm actually starting to do a little bit of that right now. There's very little on the point you're getting to, Cynthia, of what actually leads to behavior change. I mean, there's stuff about, you know, people putting solar panels on their roofs or something. I think what you're talking about is people moving to collective action. And there's just very little. There's minuscule amounts of that research. There's a lot of work on science communication and how do you shift people's beliefs, and there's some stuff on threat perception, but very little on what you're getting at. And it's a field that's ripe for investigation. I mean, just to elaborate that a little bit. So, for example, there's this, Van Zomeren review from 2008, which was going back to social movements from the 1980s. So they found dozens and dozens of papers that were from anti-nuclear, that were from discrimination, from racism, from environmentalism, all the kinds of studies that have been done across, recent history of what drives people to collective action. And they pull it all together in a big meta-analysis, and it basically says the things that drive people to collective action are, number one, their identity, number two, their feeling of injustice, and number three, their belief in sort of collective efficacy, i.e. we can do things together. And that's it. That's about it. It's very abstract. It's very, we kind of knew that already. You don't need to like do a meta-analysis, a whole bunch of studies to know those are going to be important factors. Let's kind of research at a kind of abstract, kind of untethered level. And I feel like what we need now is we need stuff that's much more concrete to this. And, acting on the climate crisis might be really different from acting on other stuff. Like I think if your local river is being poisoned by a factory, right? You're like outraged, and you get together with your neighbors and everyone else. We're gonna put a stop to that. It's very specific. It's very local. You know what to do, and you know when you win, right? But this is something else. I'm worried that this is a whole different category, because this is like, young people and not all young people like me, whatever, different ages, but basically spending a lot of time, a lot of volunteer time doing organizing and activism to shift our local institution, for example, UCSD or San Diego. San Diego is doing really good things right now, and the UC system less so. But, out of a principle that we have to sort of act on behalf of the biosphere or people in the biosphere, that is really a whole world problem that is delayed, that is deferred, that is decades long, where we'll never, not going to see like CO2 went down because we did that action. So it has these other features. But I think in the end, it's probably very similar. People that went and joined BLM felt outrage and injustice. Injustice is extremely powerful. I mean, those are protests, but it's the same thing that goes here. I think people that join the climate movement are really mostly out of a sense of deep injustice, usually on the human side, but often on the nature side, on behalf of plants and animals and species. They feel that very strongly. And so maybe it is more similar than it's different. I'm not sure. So a rather long answer, I'm sorry.
Got a question in the chat from Peter. Building off of the question of action, from an effort economy perspective, how would you recommend we divide our energy if we choose to engage? Stuff like using a bike instead of a car is easy, but much less of an impact than actions of larger agents like corporations.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lots to say about this, but keeping it brief. So first of all, I'm just speaking about myself. Sorry, I don't mean to kind of accuse anybody of anything, right? This is my feelings. Like, I don't like this argument that it's the corporations that are big polluters. Like, when people say that, they say like 80% of the emissions of the big corporations. It's true. But like, that lets us off the hook too much. We are filling our cars with gasoline from Chevron every time. And most people are banking, by the way, with Chase, Citibank, Bank of America. Bank of America financed the fossil fuel industry to the tune of $120 billion over the last 3 years. Chase, $250 billion. I shifted out of Chase to a credit union. I mean, people don't even know this, right? So yes, it's true that the big corporations are very responsible, but the big corporations are supported by most of us. So in isolation, one doesn't want to just say it's because of the corporations. That lets us off the hook. Okay, that's point one. But yes, this is a question that's getting to some really interesting issues about the difference between personal actions, personal responsibility, and group actions. Okay, and here, I think I'd say the following: there's no bright dividing line between individuals acting according to their principles and social, collective action. Right? It's kind of like what I said before, the meat eating example. If you change your diet. Not that you have to, but I did eventually. I missed the meat so much, so I get it on Christmas Day now, beef or lamb, right, once a year. But it became intolerable to me. It was like deeply inconsistent. Here I am advocating for action on climate crisis, and I'm like eating red meat. It just doesn't compute. I have to do something about that. But I on that and other issues, one communicates. So your individual action becomes kind of politicized, and politicized is not a dirty word. It's just saying you use it as a way to persuade other people. So an example of this is as follows. Greta Thunberg, who's obviously a special person and special attention, but when she burst on the scene, she made a big song and dance about the flying less, and she wasn't going to take planes, and she was going to take trains, which is easy to do in Europe, and she's going to take a boat across the ocean because she, knew millionaires or whatever. But I mean, she's principled, and she stopped, she didn't fly, and she started a flying less movement in Sweden and Germany. And in 2019, after she started that, the domestic air travel in Germany dropped 19%. And we know it's about that because international travel stayed the same. So people basically started taking trains instead of flying because of a Greta Thunberg communication effect. Now, a 19% reduction of aviation in Germany, which is the biggest economy in Europe, that's a lot of emissions. So, you see that as you act, you've got to kind of do actions as an individual in concert with other people doing those actions, right? Rather than isolated. When you do that and when you communicate it, you're doing collective action. And I think it's very powerful. And, if all the students at Rutgers would pull their money out of, those top 4 banks and put them in a local credit union, and you would spread that idea around more of those East Coast schools, and a few thousands or tens of thousands of students did that, those banks would change their freaking tune, I can tell you. That they would have to basically do a public relations exercise and say, as Chase did, Chase said, oh, we won't fund Arctic exploration anymore, but that's a tiny thing. But, it adds up, right? I don't know if that answers your question, Peter. Yes, it's and to corporations, it depends what the corporations are, right? If they're fossil fuel industry corporations, we're going to have to defeat them. Basically, that's it. And that's another whole story. Yes.
Okay. So I guess that brings us to the end of this. Unless if anyone has any questions, we can also give you Dr. Aron's email address if you'd like to ask any questions, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll put it here in the chat.
Okay. And Ayan, I think you wanted to make some comments or questions.
Yeah. I was basically just gonna wrap it up with I'm in a class that studies democracy right now. It's just this 3-hour seminar every Monday, and we go over Tocqueville, if you know who that is, and a lot of what he says focuses on using these atomic units like these towns and small communities, and in order to get accustomed to creating big change and managing the country on a national level, people have to be accustomed to making change within their own communities. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that. And he goes into it for I think maybe 50 painful pages. But that basic concept, I think, is very important because, as you said, Dr. Aron, the concept of having corporations and imposing regulations on corporations to reduce their emissions isn't enough. We have to be willing to understand the consequences of that. And in order to do that, we have to practice life as if these corporations weren't providing us with these things, with the emissions that they're producing, right? And that's so important that I think a lot of people don't understand. And they separate themselves from the problem when in reality their consumption is the problem. So yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I'm interested in that Tocqueville reference. I mean, I didn't have the pleasure to be in classes like that when I was an undergrad, so I don't know that. I mean, I know Tocqueville is, but I don't know that particular thing. So if you can pop it in there, it's great. But yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is, well, it's a few things buried, I think, in what you're saying. And part of it, I see that is the significance of local action. Part of it is the responsibility, to this issue about corporations. Peter's still here. Part of the worry I have is that a lot of people, and again, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but people need reasons not to be engaged. And people need to come up with reasons to not make this their business. And that's a kind of defense. It's a kind of denialism. I think denialism is not just about I'm a Republican in a red state and I don't believe climate change is true because my leaders are telling me that. Denialism is also about knowing that this is a serious problem, but kind of not not jumping to the responsibility, right? And I'm sympathetic to that. It's like, you know, denial is also relevant to when people die. You know, someone very close to you dies and people are in denial that they're dead, right? Because it's so painful. It's so painful to accept something that you've got to protect yourself. And I think there's a lot of that going on with this. Like, it's people are protecting themselves, so they've got to latch onto things that give them a reason not to do something. One of the things you hear is they say, oh, it's all to do with overpopulation, which is a real bullshit argument, by the way. But people say that. And it's a bullshit argument because they don't know that, you know, 57% of the emissions are done by the richest people, you know, and like 75% are done by the richest countries. I mean, the actual 3 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa and East and South Asia that are the poorest, like 10% of all the emissions of the whole world are from them, right? So overpopulation is a problem for other reasons, but it's not really our problem with emissions. And so if you're going to say it's overpopulation, you're doing that as an excuse to say there's nothing we can do because of overpopulation. And I think this corporations argument's a little bit like that. So that's one point. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, you gotta be a little bit more sophisticated in these things. And then the local thing, if that's what you're getting at, Ayan, I'm totally with that, right? Like, I mean, that's my analysis here is like, we can't sit around waiting for the UN and the US government. Like, we've tried that for 30 years now. This is about our institutions, our cities, our towns, where we are, in the places we are, in the banks we're, you know, wherever we are, right? And when those changes are made where we are, it's going to ramify. It's going to spread everywhere, and it'll basically undergird the shift. And there's lots of reasons to think that that's the way it works. Like, it's always worked like that, you know. Like, people went in the South, and if someone had said, you know what, I'm not going to desegregate my lunch counter because it's not going to make any difference. I'm just one person in one restaurant. Like, what a thing to say. All right, fine, you can say that. Like, we see in retrospect, like, no, you do it because you can. You do it because you're responsible, because you're doing it is a version of a local struggle, and then it happens in concert. And so, yeah, but this is not widely appreciated. You know, people really don't see it like this. Like, professors in the UC, particularly economists, will say to me, it's a complete waste of time what you're doing. You're focusing on UC emissions. China's emitting so much. And I think when they say that, they're using that as that excuse. They're using that as that, you know, or they don't believe, you know, or they don't believe, they don't have enough cognizance of, or they didn't take your class, the class you take. They didn't have enough cognizance of social movement theory or the struggles of the past to really realize that this is how change happens. Okay, anyway, it's late. You guys probably want to go to bed.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this is a really interesting talk.
You know, I put my email in the address, and you know, feel free to email me, and I have a lot of material I can share, or I'm happy in all of your thoughts and anything you have to say about all this. So yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Dr. Aron. Thank you so much for speaking to us about like all of these important issues.
Yeah. All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care.